The scream echoed through marble corridors that had once heard only laughter and music. In the depths of the Palatine Palace, beneath chambers where emperors had entertained senators and poets, a different kind of entertainment now unfolded. The torchlight cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with frescoes of Venus and Diana, goddesses who seemed to turn their painted eyes away from what transpired below.
Full sentence.
Caligula stood motionless in his purple-trimmed toga, watching as his Praetorian guards dragged another victim toward the bronze brazier that glowed red-hot in the chamber's centre. The woman's silk stola, once pristine white with golden threads, now hung in tatters. Her wrists bore the marks of iron shackles, and her dark hair, which had been elaborately arranged with pins of ivory and gold just hours before, now fell loose across her shoulders. The emperor's fingers drummed against the pommel of his ceremonial dagger, a rhythm that had become as familiar to the palace servants as the morning call of roosters. His eyes, those pale blue orbs that had once charmed the Roman people during his early reign, now held something that made even seasoned soldiers avert their gaze. The sweet smoke of frankincense, meant to mask other odours, could not hide the metallic scent that had begun to permeate these lower chambers. In the corner, a scribe sat hunched over his wax tablet, stylus trembling as he recorded what the emperor commanded to be preserved for posterity. His scroll would later disappear into the palace archives, sealed away from eyes that might judge too harshly. The woman's lips moved in what might have been a prayer to Minerva, goddess of wisdom, though wisdom seemed to have abandoned this place entirely. The brazier hissed as another iron tool was placed among the coals. The Palatine Hill had always been the beating heart of imperial power, its marble facades gleaming like polished bone beneath the Mediterranean sun. When Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the boy the legions had nicknamed Caligula for the tiny soldier's boots he wore as a child, ascended to the purple in the year 37 AD, Rome exhaled in collective relief. After the paranoid final years of Tiberius, who had retreated to his fortress on Capri, the empire welcomed a young emperor who promised restoration of the old republican virtues. The palace itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry that sprawled across the hilltop like a small city. Corridors lined with columns of Numidian marble led to chambers where the morning light filtered through sheets of translucent mica. Gardens perfumed with roses and jasmine surrounded reflecting pools where peacocks strutted between topiary shaped like dolphins and eagles. The dining halls could accommodate hundreds of guests, reclining on couches upholstered in silk from the distant lands of Serica, while bronze braziers burned precious woods that filled the air with aromatic smoke. Within these walls moved a carefully orchestrated hierarchy. Senators in their white togas with purple stripes arrived each dawn for the morning salutatio, bringing news from the provinces and seeking imperial favour. Freedmen, former slaves who had earned their liberty through loyal service, managed the vast bureaucracy that kept the empire functioning, their tunics of fine wool marking their elevated status. Palace slaves, many of them educated Greeks captured in distant wars, served as secretaries, tutors and artists, their iron collars hidden beneath clothing of surprising quality. The women of the imperial household occupied their own distinct sphere. Caligula's three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla and Livilla, moved through the palace like living goddesses, their stolas of shimmering silk announcing their presence before they appeared. Their hair, arranged in elaborate towers secured with pins of gold and ivory, caught the light as they glided through corridors attended by their own retinues of female slaves. These women wielded influence that extended far beyond the traditional domestic sphere, whispering counsel into the emperor's ear during private dinners and shaping policy through carefully chosen words. The Empress Milonia Caesonia, Caligula's fourth wife, had brought her own particular grace to the palace. Unlike his previous marriages, political alliances that had crumbled as quickly as they were forged, this union seemed born of genuine affection. She appeared at state banquets wearing diadems that caught the lamplight like captured stars, her presence softening the emperor's sharper edges. Her daughter, Julia Drusilla, born of their union, toddled through the palace gardens while nurses in flowing chitons watched over her play. Entertainment in the palace followed ancient traditions refined to their highest art. Poets recited verses in the great hall while musicians played lyres strung with silver wire. Dancers from Egypt and Syria performed between marble columns, their movements telling stories of gods and heroes. The emperor himself would sometimes join these performances, his voice trained in rhetoric echoing through chambers as he delivered speeches that slaves would later copy onto papyrus scrolls for distribution throughout the empire. The palace baths were themselves works of art, fed by aqueducts that brought mounting water to pools lined with mosaics depicting Neptune's kingdom. Steam rose from the caldarium while massage slaves worked perfumed oils into the skin of noble women, who reclined on marble slabs warmed by hypercaust systems that channeled heated air through hollow walls. The conversations that floated through this scented atmosphere shaped alliances and destroyed reputations with equal ease. Religious observance permeated daily life within these walls. Household shrines held bronze statues of the Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits that protected the imperial family. Each morning brought libations poured onto marble altars while priests chanted prayers that had been old when Romulus founded the city. The emperor himself, as Pontifex Maximus, presided over ceremonies that connected the palace to the divine will of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization and tradition, subtle changes began to manifest as the months of Caligula's reign accumulated. The morning salutations grew longer, as the emperor demanded increasingly elaborate displays of deference. Senators who had once approached with confident bearing now prostrated themselves fully upon the marble floors. The emperor's laughter, once warm and infectious, took on a quality that made courtiers glance nervously at one another across banquet couches. The first whispers began in the women's quarters, carried on breath scented with wine and fear. Slaves who prepared the imperial bedchamber spoke in hushed tones of sounds that echoed through marble walls, not the gentle murmurs of conjugal affection, but something altogether more disturbing. The emperor's nocturnal visits to his sister's chambers had always been explained as familial consultation, discussions of state that required privacy. But the servants who cleaned the floors each dawn began to notice things that made them avert their eyes and quicken their steps. Drusilla, the youngest and most beautiful of the three sisters, had always been Caligula's favourite. Ancient sources would later record that he had honoured her above all others, even above his own wife. In the intimate family dining room, where only blood relatives gathered, she reclined at his right hand, while he fed her delicacies with his own fingers: figs stuffed with honey, dormice seasoned with poppy seeds, peacock eggs served in silver shells. Their conversations would stretch deep into the night, punctuated by laughter that servants found increasingly difficult to interpret. The emperor had begun to dress her in the regalia of divinity. Golden diadems that caught the lamplight crowned her dark hair, while necklaces of precious stones, emeralds from Egypt, pearls from the Persian Gulf, adorned her throat. When she appeared at public ceremonies, citizens noted that she wore the stola of an empress, despite having no husband of imperial rank. More disturbing still were the private rituals that palace insiders claimed to witness. Ceremonies conducted in chambers, sealed to all but the imperial family, where incense burned before statues of gods whose worship had been forbidden since the time of Augustus. The transformation of the palace's underground chambers began under the pretext of expanding storage for wine and grain. But the slaves who laboured in those depths emerged with haunted expressions, speaking of rooms being prepared for purposes they dared not name. Iron rings were set into walls that had previously held only amphorae. Braziers designed for heating were installed in chambers far from any living quarters. Most unsettling of all were the wooden frames being constructed, devices whose purpose became clear only to those who had witnessed similar implements in gladiatorial schools where slaves were trained through pain and terror. The emperor's relationship with his Praetorian Guard evolved as well. These elite soldiers, sworn to protect the imperial person with their lives, found themselves tasked with duties that strayed far from their original mandate. They were commanded to bring certain individuals to private audiences, from which those summoned did not always emerge unchanged. The guards themselves began to display the hollow eyes of men who had witnessed things that challenged their understanding of honour and duty. Palace physicians noted an increase in their services, though the nature of the injuries they were called upon to treat was never officially recorded. Broken bones that suggested falls from great heights, burns that followed no pattern of accident, wounds that spoke of deliberate rather than random violence. These healers, bound by oaths of secrecy that predated even their medical training, applied their salves and stitched their sutures in silence, knowing that their own safety depended upon their discretion. The emperor's public persona during this period remained largely intact. He continued to appear at games in the Circus Maximus, where crowds cheered his generosity, as he distributed gold coins to the masses. His building projects proceeded on schedule. Temples rose to honor the gods. Aqueducts brought fresh water to distant provinces. Roads stretched toward barbarian frontiers. Yet those who observed him closely began to notice changes. A tremor in his hands during public speeches, eyes that focused on something beyond what others could see, laughter that came too quickly or lasted too long. Within the palace hierarchy, positions that had once been coveted began to go begging. The role of cubicularius, the slave responsible for the emperor's bedchamber, changed hands with disturbing frequency. Some left claiming illness, others simply disappeared from palace records entirely. The women who served the imperial family began requesting transfers to households of lesser nobles, accepting significant reductions in status rather than remaining in proximity to whatever was unfolding within those marble walls. The evening entertainments that had once featured poets and musicians gradually gave way to spectacles of a different nature. Gladiators were summoned not to demonstrate their skill with sword and shield, but to provide instruction in techniques whose purpose was not victory, but prolonged suffering. Executioners from the public prison were brought to the palace under cover of darkness, their expertise required for demonstrations that no citizen was meant to witness. The screams began to carry beyond the palace walls on nights when the wind shifted from the northeast. Citizens living in the wealthy districts below the Palatine hill found themselves closing their shutters against sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the wailing reached their courtyards, whispering prayers to household gods who seemed increasingly distant from the horrors unfolding above their heads. Within the palace, the morning routines that had once defined civilized life began to crumble. Senators arriving for the dawn salutatio found the marble floors stained with substances that palace slaves scrubbed frantically but could never fully remove. The sweet smoke of frankincense, once used ceremonially, now burned constantly in braziers throughout the corridors, a futile attempt to mask odours that seemed to seep from the very stones themselves. Even the peacocks that had strutted proudly through the gardens now huddled in distant corners, their jewelled plumage dulled and their piercing cries silenced. The emperor's appearance at public functions became increasingly erratic. When he did emerge from the palace depths, his purple-trimmed toga hung loosely on a frame that had grown gaunt despite the palace's abundant feasts. His pale eyes, once merely unsettling, now held a quality that made even his most loyal praetorians step backward when he approached. During one memorable appearance at the theatre, he began laughing at a tragic scene depicting the death of Iphigenia, his mirth echoing through the stone seats, until the entire audience fell silent in horrified confusion. The fate of those who disappeared into the palace's lower chambers became a source of whispered speculation throughout Rome. Wives of senators who had been summoned for private audiences were sometimes returned to their families days later, their minds apparently shattered by experiences they could not or would not describe. Others never returned at all, their absence explained by official proclamations of sudden illness or voluntary exile to distant provinces. The imperial physicians, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something approaching despair, moved through the palace like ghosts, their medical bags heavy with implements designed not to heal, but to preserve life in circumstances where death would have been mercy. Milonia Caesonia, the empress who had once softened her husband's harsh edges, began to appear at state functions with makeup applied so thickly that it resembled a funeral mask. Her movements, once graceful, became mechanical, as though she navigated through her daily existence by memory alone. Palace servants noted that she had taken to wearing heavy jewellery, bracelets, necklaces and rings, not for adornment, but seemingly to weigh herself down, as though without such anchoring, she might simply float away from a reality that had become unbearable. The emperor's sisters, who had once moved through the palace like living goddesses, now appeared only rarely in public spaces. When they did emerge from their chambers, their elaborate hairstyles could not conceal the tremor in their hands, or the way their eyes darted constantly toward doorways and shadows. Drusilla, the beloved favourite, developed a nervous habit of touching the golden amulets at her throat, protective charms that seemed to offer no protection against whatever horrors she had witnessed or endured. The palace staff began to desert their posts with increasing frequency. Skilled artisans who had served the imperial household for decades suddenly claimed family emergencies in distant provinces. Kitchen slaves, who had once competed for the privilege of preparing imperial meals, now drew lots to determine who would venture into the upper chambers with food and wine. Even the palace guards, elite soldiers who had sworn blood oaths of loyalty, began requesting transfers to frontier postings where they might face barbarian armies rather than whatever their emperor had become. The underground chambers that had been modified for the emperor's entertainment began to affect the structure of the palace itself. Servants reported that certain corridors had developed an echo that seemed to amplify sounds from below, while others noticed that marble statues positioned near hidden entrances had begun to weep, a phenomenon that palace engineers attributed to changes in underground humidity, but which created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that no rational explanation could dispel. Rome's wealthy classes, who had once competed for invitations to imperial banquets, now found excuses to avoid the palace entirely. Senators claimed pressing business in their home provinces. Wealthy merchants discovered urgent trade missions that required their immediate attention. Even the emperor's former friends from his youth, men who had grown up alongside him in the shadow of Augustus's legacy, began to cross streets when they saw imperial litters approaching. The very air within the palace seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult and sleep impossible. Servants reported nightmares that seemed to seep through the walls themselves, while even the emperor's hunting dogs, magnificent beasts bred for courage, began to refuse entry into certain sections of the building, their hackles raised and their eyes rolling white with terror. The palace fell silent on the Ides of Januarius in the year 41 AD, but it was not the peaceful silence of prayer or contemplation. It was the hollow quiet that follows the sudden cessation of screaming, an absence so complete that it seemed to echo more loudly than any sound. In the underground chambers where torchlight had flickered against bronze instruments of unspeakable purpose, the braziers had grown cold. The iron rings set into marble walls held only empty shackles that swayed slightly in air currents that carried no scent of frankincense, no desperate prayers to gods who had long since turned their faces away. Cassius Chaerea struck the first blow in a narrow corridor beneath the palace, his gladius finding the gap between the emperor's ribs, with the precision of a man who had waited months for that single moment. The other conspirators, Praetorians who had sworn oaths to protect the life they now ended, fell upon their emperor with a fury that spoke not of political necessity, but of something far more personal. When their work was finished, Caligula's body bore 29 wounds, each one delivered by men who had witnessed what transpired in those sealed chambers, and could no longer call themselves soldiers of honor while such things continued. The immediate aftermath brought no celebration, no joy of liberation. The conspirators stood in that blood-soaked corridor surrounded by silence that felt heavier than the screams it had replaced. They had expected relief, the lightening of burden that comes with duty fulfilled. Instead, they found themselves staring at the corpse of a man whose crimes had been so intimate, so deliberately hidden, that even his death could not erase what he had wrought within those marble walls. In the women's quarters, Milonia Caesonia sat motionless beside her infant daughter's cradle, her painted mask finely cracked to reveal eyes that held no surprise at the sounds of violence echoing from below. She made no attempt to flee, no effort to gather the child and escape to her family's estates beyond the city. When the Praetorians came for her, she stood with the dignity of a woman who had been waiting for this moment, perhaps praying for it. Her death came swiftly, a mercy that had been denied to others within those walls. The palace servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, fulfilling their final duties. They gathered the imperial regalia, the purple-trimmed togas, the golden diadems, the ceremonial daggers, and packed them into cedar chests that would be buried in unmarked locations. The underground chambers were sealed with stones and mortar, their entrances hidden behind false walls that would puzzle archaeologists in distant centuries. The bronze instruments of torture were melted down, their metal returned to forms that could serve life rather than destroy it. Yet questions lingered in the spaces between the stones, in the shadows that seemed darker than they had been before, in the echoes that bounced strangely through certain corridors. Palace records from those final months had disappeared, scrolls that might have contained testimony, confessions, or evidence of the full scope of what had transpired. Some claimed the documents had been destroyed by the conspirators to protect the victims' families from scandal. Others whispered that the records had been hidden, waiting to surface in some future age when the truth might finally be spoken without fear. The sisters survived, Agrippina and Livilla at least, For Drusilla had died months before the assassination, succumbing to an illness that physicians could not diagnose and palace rumour attributed to causes that were never officially acknowledged. These surviving women retreated to the private villas where they lived in seclusion, their silence purchased with generous pensions and the implicit understanding that certain memories were too dangerous to become public knowledge. They took their secrets to graves marked with inscriptions that praised their virtue and piety, while saying nothing of their suffering. Claudius, dragged trembling from behind a curtain to assume the purple, ordered the palace purified by priests who performed rituals that had not been necessary since the earliest days of the Republic. They burned sacred herbs, poured libations to gods of purification, and spoke words meant to cleanse spaces contaminated by acts that challenged the very foundations of Roman law and morality. Yet even these holy men seemed reluctant to venture into certain sections of the building, and their ceremonies left behind an atmosphere that felt cleansed, but not healed. The greatest question remained unspoken in the years that followed: how many had known? How many senators had heard rumours and chosen silence over investigation? How many citizens had noticed the changes in their emperor and decided that willful blindness served them better than dangerous knowledge? The conspiracy that ended Caligula's life involved fewer than a dozen men, but the conspiracy of silence that had enabled his crimes may have encompassed thousands. In the end, the marble walls themselves became the only witnesses whose testimony could never be silenced or corrupted. They held within their stone the echoes of screams that would never fully fade, the memory of torchlight that revealed horrors no civilized eye should witness, and the knowledge that even the mightiest empire in human history could harbour darkness so profound that its true extent might never be measured. The question that haunted Rome long after Caligula's death was not what he had done, but what else might have been possible had those marble walls been allowed to keep their secrets forever.